I am so ready for this to be the end of the water type guide gauntlet that started with the horsey line. Normally, it's not so bad. I do one water type guide every now and then we go back to a normal dry land Pokemon. But these past three have had me consistently looking into water ecosystems and the like. For those that have been following this series for a decent amount of time, know I hate deep water and the things that can be found there. They freak me out. Now, the Goldeen line wasn't too bad because they're freshwater Pokemon, but the Horsey line was terrible for me to look through, and now the subjects of this guide are even worse, as they are the exact kind of strange, alien biology that makes the deep ocean so unsettling to me. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we're going to be going through the Staryu line, which, of course, includes Staryu and its evolution Starmie. Staryu is a Pokemon whose body shape is a stereotypical 5-pointed star. The body is predominantly a brownish color. However, situated in the center of its body, it has an external organ that looks very much like a gem housed in a golden fitting. It's not actually any of those things, it's just more of the Pokemon's flesh, but it holds an uncanny resistance to it, almost more hardness than normal flesh, but not quite to the point of metal. Staryu is also a decently sized Pokemon, standing at 2.5 feet tall, 0.76 meters, and weighing about 76 pounds, or 34.5 kilograms. When you expose a Staryu to a water stone, though, it evolves into a Starmie. Starmie keeps the same base body plan as Staryu, but now it looks like it has a second star-shaped body attached to it from the back. The brown color has been replaced with a deeper purple, and the gem that's situated in the center of its body has grown larger, growing facets like an actual gem. Still, remember, it isn't an actual gem, but the resemblance has gotten closer thanks to the evolution. Starmie has also gotten larger, as most evolutions do, now standing 3.5 feet tall, or just over 1 meter, and weighing an average of 176 pounds, that being an even 80 kilograms. In total, they aren't the biggest water-type Pokemon out there, but they do have strange and alien biology that's really unlike anything that we've covered so far in these guides. Maybe that will lead to some unique challenges that have to be confronted in the care of these Pokemon, and who knows? Maybe those unique quirks will possibly make these Pokemon the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Obviously, we're going to be setting up another aquatic enclosure for these Pokemon. And, much like the Horsey line, it's going to have to be another saltwater enclosure. However, the Staryu line are very sensitive to any small change in their environment on multiple different factors, like salinity, water temperatures, and pH levels. In general, you want to keep the salinity between 1.022 and 1.025. This can easily be checked up upon using a salinity test and should be done at least once a week to ensure that the salt levels stay stable over time. If it starts to get too low or too high, then you may have to start changing out water and introducing new water to balance the levels out and to avoid your Pokemon going into salinity shock, where they get too much or too little salt in their systems. The same can also be said for the temperatures. They like to sit in a very narrow range of temperatures, between 72 to 76 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 to 24 degrees Celsius. That's a very narrow range to have to keep all the water in your tank at. And remember that these Pokemon tend to spend the majority of their time at the bottom of the tank. The cold water settles at the bottom of the enclosure, so you have to make sure that the bottom of the tank reaches at least the minimum temperature. But, considering that these Pokemon tend to go to the surface of the enclosure at night, spoiler alert for the care section I guess, you have to make sure you don't heat the upper water too much trying to heat the bottom up. It's a slight issue that is common among these Pokemon's tanks. The best way to combat this issue is to have a decent circulation in your tank. That way the water is constantly being cycled from the top of the enclosure to the bottom and back again, evening out the temperature. Granted, the good circulation will also be needed to help with other things, such as oxygenating the water for your Pokemon and keeping things like algae from growing in the tank. And as for the pH levels, you want to try and keep them around the 8.1 to 8.5 range, which is slightly more on the alkaline or basic side of the scale. However, that doesn't mean that they can withstand sudden changes to their pH, even within that range. These Pokemon are, again, very sensitive to sudden changes like that, meaning that if you notice that the levels are rising or dropping into dangerous areas, then you have to gradually change out the water for them to get the levels back under control. Just suddenly shifting the pH on them can cause them to go into a system shock, and that won't be good. To ensure that you're always on top of this, you should be checking the pH levels about the same as the salinity, about once a week. On to the specifics of the tank itself. For a Staryu, the tank needs to be wide enough for it to move around and to explore the base of the tank, while being deep enough to allow it to swim to the surface at night. In reality, you would probably need an enclosure that is at least 10 feet on a side and at least 4 feet deep. You may be wondering why you need an enclosure that's so big. That's fair, thanks to the fact that their arms don't move that much. A lot of people assume that they don't move around much at all. While you would be right in the fact that their arms aren't that mobile, they are able to move around quite a bit, scouring the ocean floor, or in this case the tank bottom, in search of food. Hence why it's a more horizontal than it is vertical tank. However, Starmie needs a much larger tank than that. Thanks to the extra part on its body that can spin, they are more able to swim through the water and therefore require more space to do so. Their tank should most likely be the size of your average in-ground pool, being 30 feet on each side and having a depth of at least 6 feet deep. This, of course, means you'll be having to house these Pokemon outside, as I doubt any but the richest of people have the space to put that kind of tank inside their house. This does, unfortunately, mean that you won't be able to keep these Pokemon in regions where the winters can get pretty harsh, as they tend to not do well in colder biomes, but unfortunately there's really no other way to get around that unfortunate restriction. Of course, you'll also need the basic stuff for an aquatic habitat once the tank is set. After this gauntlet of aquatic Pokemon that we've covered in the past few guides, it should all sound very familiar. A filter, something to create a gentle current in the water for the Pokemon, and some ground decorations on the floor of the tank. Since you're going to be using salt water in these tanks, you'll have to make sure that the filter you get is specified for salt water, and you want to avoid getting something that'll make too strong of a current. Starmie might be a great swimmer, but Staryu isn't the strongest swimmer out there, and can easily get caught up in a strong current and then get caught in the corner or against the glass. Some decorations that you can use for the enclosures are things that will give the Pokemon places to explore and places to hide. You want things like rocks, small cave formations, you can use some fake coral, anything along those lines. Don't make the tank too crowded, but by decorating the tank with these things, you give the Pokemon plenty of things to use as enrichment. One special thing that you'll have to make for these Pokemon is to make sure that they're able to see the night sky. During the night, if the sky is clear, these Pokemon will often travel to the surface of the water and their gems will begin to glow and twinkle like stars themselves. When they do this in large groups, it's quite a sight to see, the water beginning to glow red like that. I've even seen it myself a couple times on trips to Andella Town, and even someone with my crippling fear of deep water was mesmerized by how amazing it looked. There is even evidence of Starmie transmitting some form of wave up to the sky, though the exact purpose of that is not known at this time. This fascination with the night sky, as well as the star shape of their bodies, has led to the rumor that these Pokemon are really extraterrestrial creatures. I'm not too sure of that, but what I am sure of is that you'll have to make sure that these Pokemon get a good view of the stars at night. You can do this by having a clear lid for the enclosure, having a top that you can remove and replace, or having something like a mesh on the top. I personally recommend the last option, as it will still allow things like fresh air and light to get into the enclosure without you having to worry about things like leaves or bug Pokemon getting caught in the water. Which nicely brings me to other Pokemon that can be housed with the Staryu line. Because I mentioned them coming to the surface in large groups just a minute ago, it's clear that they do well with others of their own species. And, since these are an entirely aquatic species, clearly anything that can't survive in an entirely aquatic environment is a no-go to house with them. As well, anything that's large enough to take a bite out of a Staryu or a Starmie is going to do so. Even smaller species like the Finneon line will take bites out of a Staryu, so you want to avoid anything like that. I know that technically it won't do any damage to the Pokemon as they have an impressive regeneration rate, but it's still not a comfortable thing to have something munching on you, and should be avoided to keep the Pokemon happy and healthy. Really, the category that you're looking for when trying to find a cohabitant for these guys are small, non-aggressive, herbivorous aquatic Pokemon. Things like Clamperl or Corsola would be good tank mates with them in a tropical-themed enclosure. Though, all of those species would compete with each other for food in the enclosure, so keep that in mind if you do decide to go that route. And always remember that the dimensions and specifications that I provide in this section are only for one member of the subject species. If you decide to increase the number of individuals or increase the variety of Pokemon in the enclosure, be sure to make adjustments as they're needed. Availability. The thing that's nice about these Pokemon is that they have at least a minor presence in most regions. In fact, I think the only regions that don't have a native population of the Staryu line are the Paldea region and mainland Galar. In their home region of Kanto, they only live in some of the northernmost waters, like the Vermilion City shore and just south of Pallet Town. Some old reports have them living in the more southern Cantonian waters, surrounding the Seafoam Islands, but I'm not sure how authentic they are, as those waters are pretty cold and can be pretty deep away from the islands. I should also say that they live in places like One Island and Five Island. I know they aren't technically part of the Kanto region, but it's the closest region to them, and I wasn't sure where else to put them. This is also pretty much the pattern they follow for the rest of the regions. Places like the western seas of the Johto region, the shallow waters surrounding Lilycove City and Hoenn, as well as the shallow, warmer waters of Canalave City and Sunnyshore City in the Sinnoh region. There's the waters in the Wele Volcano Park and Alola's Route 7, as well as sometimes showing up on Hano Beach, which, now that I'm looking at, probably isn't that good for them to be out of the water like that. Even my home region of Unova, which is well known for its attempt to keep invasive species out of the ecosystem, has a natural population of these guys on Route 13. And, like I said, mainland Galar doesn't have any of them, but if you travel to the Isle of Armor, then you can find them in the waters of Challenge Beach. So, while not the most widespread of species, you can get to a spot where you can find them without ever leaving your home region. Again, besides Paldeans. You guys will need to go a bit further. And I should say that Staryu are the most common members of this line to find in the wild. Thanks to the fact that they live in shallow waters and natural water stones are often found in deeper parts of the ocean, it's very rare for a Starmie to come about in nature. If you're looking for one of those, then you're going to have to spend a much harder time getting a hold of one of them. As for the breeding scene for these Pokemon, it's not the most robust in the world, but it's also not what I would consider rare in the industry. These are some of the few Pokemon that are confirmed to be genderless, meaning they don't reproduce like the majority of the Pokemon in the world. In Staryu and Starmie's case, they tend to reproduce through a process known as fission, where the Pokemon itself chooses to split itself into two halves, each taking part of the core. From those halves, a new Pokemon can grow as long as the cores aren't excessively damaged at all. I'm sure that surprises many of you, as it's a commonly known fact that these Pokemon can regrow limbs so long as the core is intact. So, if it has to split the core in order to divide, then how does each half regrow into a new Staryu? Well, unlike when being attacked by a predator, the core isn't damaged in the fission process. After all, this is the way the species reproduces. It would be a pretty bad way to raise the population if they ended up harming themselves simply by doing it. But back to the breeding situation, this means the reproduction, along with their relatively simple enclosure needs, means that it's very easy for a breeder to end up with a large population of these Pokemon to sell. That being said, these aren't the most popular Pokemon in the world, so some people don't see them as worth the investment. As well, if you're looking for a Starmie right away instead of a Staryu, then you might have to ask the breeder for that one special. It is a Waterstone evolution, meaning that it can be pretty expensive to just keep a Starmie without being certain someone's gonna buy it. Plus, Starmie just reproduces into more Staryu, so it's not like you can get more Starmie that way. At the end of the day, these guys shouldn't pose any major issues to find for sale so long as you're willing to look farther away than your local area. Catchability. Thankfully, since the Staryu line tends to live in the more shallow places around the world, you can hopefully avoid some of the more dangerous examples of aquatic life. But you are still going to be fishing for these guys, so you always have the problem of possibly running into something you don't expect. Always make sure you have a Pokemon with you to help protect you from any Pokemon that you pull up from the depths, even if it is the Staryu evolution you're expecting. To that end, an electric or grass-type Pokemon would be the best to bring along with you. It will probably end up being the most effective by far. As for the gear you'll need, you shouldn't need anything too expensive or high-end. Something decent enough to handle a few of the stronger Pokemon out there should be good enough. Now, if you don't want to deal with fishing, then you do have the option of trying to wait until night when they come to the surface. Make sure it's a clear night, as they don't tend to do this on a cloudy night when the moon and stars are blocked. When you begin to see the flashing red lights appear just below the surface of the water, that's your chance to throw your Pokeball at them. Just be aware that you are not pulling an individual up from the ocean floor, you're throwing something into a crowd of these Pokemon, and I'll be honest, I don't know if they'll swarm you or flee when they come under attack. Just a heads up on that. On Staryu, a Pokeball or Great Ball would be best, though the former might be a bit underpowered, and if you manage to find one of the rare Starmies out there, then you should absolutely use an Ultra Ball on it. Care. One thing we haven't talked about at all during this guide is how to feed these Pokemon. I mean, they don't even have a mouth, so it's not like you can just throw food in the enclosure like the horsey line. No, these guys are actually filter feeders, feeding on microscopic organisms that float through the water called plankton. Usually, these creatures exist almost everywhere in the ocean and oftentimes are the base of the entire food chain in any given marine ecosystem. And so, you are going to have to feed them to your Staryu evolution, which can be done two different ways. One is that you can just get a live colony of plankton and add them to your Pokemon's tank. The benefit of this is that plankton can help to keep your tank cleaner longer, as they will often eat things like algae, bacteria, and even break down and eat the waste from your Pokemon. Also, if they are well fed, then the colony can keep itself sustained over time, meaning that you wouldn't really have to worry about feeding your Pokemon, as they should be able to feed themselves at that point. The downsides to this are that it can be kind of hard to maintain a viable plankton population in a tank such as these. They oftentimes get sucked into the filter, which of course isn't good for them, and as we'll cover in a second, you're going to have to change out the water of the enclosure to keep it clean, meaning that you're either going to have to go through the arduous task of filtering out the plankton without harming them and placing them back in the water, or just accept that you're going to lose a part of the plankton population when you change out the water and be prepared to add more back in. They will also need a place that they can hide and get away from your Staryu evolution, a place where they can repopulate without being eaten. A small cave or rocky overhang should do the trick for this. Lastly, I know there are plenty of people out there that don't like feeding live creatures to their pets, no matter how small or down the food chain they are. So a live colony of plankton for your Pokemon to feed on can make some people out there not feel comfortable. On the tail of that, the second option is to use powdered plankton that you can add to the water. These are often dried out plankton that have been harvested and are sold in bags or containers of some kind. The major benefit to this kind of feeding is that you don't have to worry about keeping the colony alive. No worrying about them getting pulled into the filter or giving them a safe place to breed. You just have to make sure that you remember to feed your Pokemon every 2 to 3 days and they should be just fine. As for how much of this to feed your Pokemon, well, it's kinda hard to tell. Being filter feeders, we aren't really sure how much they eat over the course of a day, as they can just continuously suck in food as the water moves around them. To that end, always check the instructions for whatever brand powder you buy, and if needed, contact the manufacturer for better instructions. The downsides to this are pretty much the opposite from the other method. The powder can sometimes not entirely get eaten right away, meaning that it can end up turning the water and the tank itself pretty gross. It means that you have to actively remember to feed them instead of just checking to see if the population is stable. And it means that you have to continuously buy the powdered stock when you start to run out. Really, what method you go with is a matter of if you want more complex enclosure or if you want to deal with slightly more cleaning. And speaking of cleaning, that is going to be the other major part of care for these Pokemon, as it is for any aquatic enclosure. To be honest, I've gone over cleaning aquatic enclosures in depth for the last 2 guides that I've done, and I don't think that having 3 videos in a row explaining the same thing over and over again is going to be that entertaining. So for here, I'm just going to blitz through the main talking points, and if you want more in-depth understanding of how to clean an aquatic enclosure, then you can go ahead and check out the Horsey guide I have up, or any other of the tank-dwelling Pokemon that I've done guides on. The first thing that you have to consider is that you'll have to keep the actual equipment of the enclosure clean of things like bacteria, algae, and mold. This means things like scrubbing the tank walls, cleaning the decor along with the bottom with a brush and cleaner, and pulling the filter out of the filtration system and cleaning that. When using a cleaner for the inside of the tank, make sure that the cleaner doesn't have any large amounts of copper in it. Copper, for whatever reason, in the Staryu line has a large effect on cell regulation and cell function, so be sure that the cleaner you have is not only aquatic Pokemon safe, but also doesn't have any copper in it. Also, remember that the feeding method you choose might have an effect on the cleanliness of the tank. Having a living colony of plankton will mean less cleaning required as they eat the bacteria and algae growing on the tank. But when you change out the filter, you might have to deal with a small colony of plankton living in the filter system or having gotten caught in the filter itself. And if you decide to go with the powdered food, then you'll probably have to clean more often than those who have the colony, probably every 2 weeks or so. Also, you'll have to change out the water from the tank and replace it with new water on about the same schedule, every 2 weeks or so. When you do this, you will only be changing about 20% of the total water, as if you change too much water at any given time, then the different levels of pH and temperature might send your Pokemon into shock, which, as I've mentioned, is never a good thing. Of course, you should be checking the levels of your tank daily, and if they start to get out of whack, then you'll have to begin changing the water a lot more frequently until the levels are back to normal. Also, for those of you that have the live population of plankton, when you change out the water, you'll have to run it through a specialized filter to try and get the plankton out of it, and then put them back in the tank. That, or you could just get rid of them along with the water, but to me it just seems like a waste to get rid of a portion of the population that's supporting your Pokemon. It might be more of a pain in the butt to filter them out, but I think the extra effort is worth it in the long run. One last thing that I wanted to talk about is the whole splitting to reproduce thing. If you are doing things right, then your Pokemon should be well fed and comfortable in their enclosure. Depending on a few different factors, this can lead to the Pokemon to feel like it's time to reproduce. If you end up looking into the enclosure and notice that your Pokemon has split and you don't want to or don't have the space to keep them, then you have a few options. First, you can capture whichever individual is not tied to the Pokeball you already have and then release them into an appropriate environment. Don't just release them into whichever body of water turns out to be the closest. Odds are it's not correct. Second, you can try to sell them yourself to someone who is looking for a Staryu evolution. If you do this, then please be sure that you make sure the person has the facilities to properly care for one of these Pokemon. No one likes to see a Pokemon mistreated. And lastly is that you can try to sell or give them to a person or breeder that you got yours from. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't want to simply add individuals into their stock, but they may refuse, so always keep that in mind. Remember that splitting is certainly something that can happen with these Pokemon, and should be something that you're prepared to deal with at any time. Best to always be prepared and not need to be, than to be caught unprepared. Cost. The Pokemon itself isn't going to be too bad. Sure, there may not be an abundance of people that are selling them, but thanks to the ease in which they replicate and the fact that their enclosures and food aren't that bad to maintain, the people that do sell them tend to keep the price more in the low category. Though, keep in mind that if you want to buy a Starmie, then that price could go up to the moderate category to cover the price of the evolution stone needed. Food isn't going to be that bad either. If you decide to go with the live population of plankton, then you'll have an upfront cost that shouldn't go above the very low category per container of live specimen. And if you have to add to the population, then it shouldn't go above that either. As for the powdered stuff, you can buy them in large quantities and store them for later, but it does end up becoming more expensive, being an average price in the low category per month. Really, the trade-off there is that it ends up being more expensive, but you don't have to worry about the live creatures and maintaining their population along with caring for your Staryu evolution. The enclosure, as always, is going to be the spot where you spend the most money. Staryu's enclosure, being the smallest of the two, will be less expensive, probably near the top of the moderate price range or the low end of the high range. As for Starmie, that moves up to the upper end of the high category, or, depending on how fancy you want to get and the company you decide to build it for, can go over into the very high category. And for those of you that are wondering what those categories mean, I always make sure to put them in the description of the video below. Conclusion. These Pokemon can make very interesting pets. They aren't like most of the other water types that we've covered in these guides. Actually, now that I think about it, they're a lot like the Grimer line. They divide to reproduce, they have strange and alien biology and behavior, and they even eat a lot of things that other Pokemon ignore. Thankfully though, the one major downside to the Grimer line, their overly toxic nature, isn't present with the Staryu line. Instead, you have a Pokemon line that I think makes a decent Pokemon for someone who has a little bit of experience with keeping aquatic Pokemon and is looking for something unique and interesting to care for. They don't really have any major challenges like a Kingdra, and they aren't dangerous like a Gyarados. If that sounds like something you would be interested in, then I can absolutely see the Staryu line being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the psychic mime Pokemon Mime Jr. and its evolution Mr. Mime. Have a wonderful night, everyone.